Moving on to another interesting topic. So, anybody who's working in and around tech has certainly heard a lot about blockchain in the last couple of years. Extremely disruptive technology across loyalty, financial services, supply chain management. Also, one of those technologies that's tough to wrap your brain around. I mean, the number of YouTube videos I've watched, like Explainer 101 videos on blockchain, is remarkable. So. Talha Atta of MLG Blockchain Consulting is going to come up. She's 17 years old and going to talk to you a little bit about blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and talk about how it's going to impact multiple industries over the next several years. So, Talha? Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. So when I was 5 years old, my parents took me back home to Kashmir for 3 months and involved me missing important 3 months of senior kindergarten. Now, for those of you who don't know what Kashmir is, it's a small piece of land located between Pakistan and India, and since both countries have claims over it, it's a disputed territory. So I went between January and March 2006, and at first, I was really excited to go and meet all the family my parents would tell me constant stories about. But when I first got there, it was a huge culture shock. Pakistan was completely different than what I imagined it would be like. So I don't remember January, February that much, but one day I do remember is March 3rd, and that was the day I turned 6 years old. So we don't really celebrate birthdays in Kashmir. What we did do to make me feel special was have a dinner. And during this dinner, I was sitting next to my grandma, who was asking me a lot of questions, like what my plans were now that I'm getting older, and when I plan to get married. So being an awkward 5-year-old, I tried to ask her a few questions as well. So I asked her, how about you tell me how old you are? She stuttered for a second, and she gave me an awkward pause and then said, 62 or 64. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure. That's the question and answer my friend gives me when I ask him, do you want KFC or McDonald's for lunch? Not something that someone tells you when I ask them how old you are. For me, age was something that's black, white, and concrete. And when you look at issues in Pakistan, proof of birth is only one of the many issues that occurs. For example, taking a step further, you can start to see land ownership, bank accounts, and passports are all issues that happen for people living in places like Kashmir. For starters, people don't actually own the land they live on. They may habitate it, but officially and legally, anyone like the government or a third party could come out and force them out of their homes. These people don't have bank accounts. The cost of infrastructure is just too high, and there's a lot of high economic costs involved with moving money. And worst of all, they don't have passports or any sort of identification card, which means they can never leave the country. And this might be okay for an individual problem, but when brought together, it creates one of the world's biggest problems, which is these people live on land they don't officially own. They can basically never leave, and even if they could, all the wealth that they own, which is in the form of their house, their livestock, or jewelry, they can't take it with them. And for you, these people might be strangers, but for me and many people in this room, these are friends, family, and relatives who will never see economic opportunity in their lifetime. And it's not just the people in Pakistan who face these issues. It's over 2.5 billion people who have no access to financial infrastructure and over 1 billion people who have no legal identity. And when I look really deep into these issues because it's something I'm really passionate about. And the issues I constantly see arise are high transaction costs, no trusted third parties, and it's really difficult to verify documentations. If any of you guys in the room are familiar with the word remittance, you probably know the fees are really high. 15%, sometimes 30%, or somewhere around there. So if I want to send $100 to Pakistan, only 85 would get there. And for you, that might seem like it's not much of a difference, but for people whose daily wage is just $1, that's almost a half of a month's income being eaten up by one transfer. Their global remittance market is $20 billion, and it just shouldn't be that hard to send money across the globe. There's also no trusted third parties. In Canada, we might have stable banks, we might have stable governments, but these people who are constantly surrounded by governments that are in turmoil or banks who are constantly caught for corruption, they don't know where to get documentation or store your money. And finally, did you know that almost 40% of the documentation that exists in Pakistan is often bought from the black market or is forged so people can finally access something. So this brings a large question into order. There's 3.5 billion people, that's almost half the world's population, and they have no access to financial infrastructure, and they have no identity. So how do we just focus on onboarding the next billion people to the digital world? And that answer is sort of simple, but not really. And that involves two things. Something called social infrastructure and lowering the cost of an economic transactions. If you look at a lot of research conducted by the United Nations about social infrastructure, you can actually directly correlate someone's high quality of life based on how high the level of documentation is in their country. So if you could somehow successfully give people social infrastructure and documentation and lower economic costs for transactions, we could be solving a lot of problems in the world. And this is where something called Bitcoin comes into play. And while a lot of people are focused on Bitcoin hitting 100K and making a lot of money, I'm more impressed by the powerhouse underneath called blockchain technology. In 2009, someone by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin to solve a lot of problems, mainly high transfer fees, the difficulty of sending money across borders, and many more. And to give you a high-level overview 101 of blockchain technology, you can imagine blockchain as a distributed ledger that runs across a network of many computers. And since this blockchain runs on many computers, it gives it a lot of unique features. Blockchain is digital, decentralized, distributed, and it's global. Which means since it's distributed, everyone in the world has the same access to the information, and since it's decentralized, there's no single fault tolerance, which means in order to take down a blockchain network, you must take down hundreds or sometimes even thousands of computers. And while comparing this to the internet, we can look at it like this. When internet started spreading in the 90s, it was a democratization of information. Suddenly, everyone in the world, no matter where they lived or who they were, had access to this information. However, the internet does have its fault. In order to share stuff on the internet, it must be copied and distributed. However, if it was something like money, we can't really transfer something of value. Imagine me sending you $5 and you have the ability to transfer into $100 or $500 or even $1,000. And this is where blockchain comes in. Blockchain gives us the ability to democratize access to value. Now, anyone in the world or anyone in any place can get cheap and affordable access to blockchain. You no longer need an ID to actually send money over or even an ID to open up a bank account. All you need is mobile device and access to the internet. And the reason this is possible is because there are no longer third-party intermediaries. Now, intermediaries is a really popular term that pops up when you talk about blockchain. And to give you an example of a few, it's banks, it's governments, and it's really big tech companies. And for a long time, we rely on these people to facilitate economic transactions. However, we constantly see in the media today companies like Facebook or companies like Google constantly selling our data, or companies like Equifax getting millions of identities stolen with no consequences. Or worst of all, for some of my family in Kashmir, where the government is constantly in turmoil, they just don't have anywhere to access documentation or even receive these services. So now with blockchain, we have these global, decentralized, large databases of value, and they can't be tampered with, no one can corrupt it, and it can never be deleted, only transferred. So all these problems that seem really big and really hard to solve, we can start to break them down and actually think of tangible solutions like land ownership. We no longer need to rely on a government or some sort of third party to store land ownership. We can create blockchain deeds and use the blockchain to make sure everyone has a right to own their land and everyone has a right to exist. We can give everyone bank accounts. People no longer need some sort of ID or to go to a big institution that might take their money. They can all store wealth completely by themselves using something called private keys. And finally, these blockchains can be used to create reputation systems and identity systems so everyone has a right to exist. And although this all seems pretty abstract, we can start to look at things that are happening today. If you look at a platform called Ethereum, which is a second really large cryptocurrency, although the actual platform itself creates zero revenue, the creators created some sort of platform which allows the other people the ability to create value, to transfer it, and to basically code any application they want on a decentralized network. And although the platform makes zero revenue, both the users and the creators benefit because that's the way economic transactions exist. Everyone participating in the network gains some sort of tangible value. And this power transfer is already starting to happen. When you look at decentralized applications that are rising today, we're already seeing decentralized versions of Facebook or decentralized versions of health apps where you can actually get rewarded for doing things you already do, like walking or utilizing social networks. And continue to talk about Ethereum, Ethereum created more millionaires than any other company on this earth, more than Facebook, more than Google, and more than Alibaba. And Bitcoin was the first time in history where an average Joe in his basement with a Bitcoin miner was ahead of the big institutions like JP Morgan and like TD Bank. And now we have the power to democratize wealth. Wealth no longer belongs to the top 1%. First, we can bring the next 3.5 billion people to the digital economy. And over the next 5 to 10 years, I really believe we're going to see the biggest power transfers and wealth of all time. And I look forward to all of us regaining our financial abilities and economic power with the power of blockchain. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Well, so when you look at land ownership platforms today, a lot of that's taken into consider with something called game theory. So people could definitely lie. There could always be solutions where someone's identity does get stolen and they can still transfer something. But eventually, I think right now we should just focus on the technology and actually implementing scalable and real solutions, and all the nitty-gritty things, I think as the technology progresses, will get slowly worked out.
Any other questions?
Data sovereignty is a big talking point in today's tech world. How do you think blockchain is going to affect the way we interact with our data and the way companies interact with their data?
For sure. So I mentioned data sovereignty in my presentation. And when you look at someone like use their own data, one really beneficial part about the blockchain is, although blockchain information is all public, we have both the ability to have something called permissioned blockchains, which means people can only get access to your data or your private information actually stored on blocks by you giving them access. And I believe blockchain is not only the solution for keeping data safe, but it's going to be used in a lot of other technologies to make sure data rights are held.